Podcasts on UNC-TV.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.
Funding for In the Garden is provided by UNC-TV members and by Academic Programs and North Carolina Cooperative Extension. Both are members of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at North Carolina State University.
Hi, and welcome to In the Garden. I'm Bryce Lane. Gardening with an efficient approach to watering is here to stay. With limited water resources, water restrictions, and a growing North Carolina population, we home gardeners need to develop strategies to conserve water. Well, on today's show, we'll talk about using the right water-wise steps in our garden that will yield perennial success so that our plants will continue to benefit the environment and provide beauty to our gardens. One of the most important steps in water-wise gardening has really nothing to do with water or with plant selection, but has everything to do with the soil and site preparation. Folks, it's really important to get a good, well-prepared site in order to conserve water in your landscape in a long term. So what we want to talk about is this landscape site. The soil in most home landscapes is very poor. It's often extremely compacted, it's subsoil, and it is not very conducive for plants. Oftentimes what happens, it rains, the water comes down, it doesn't infiltrate very well, and a lot of it just runs off. So the most important thing we can do is add organic matter to our soils. Now, organic matter is a great material that we can't add enough of to our soils. By using organic matter, it improves infiltration, it improves the biology of the soil. In addition, the soil texture and soil structure is improved. You get good root spread, and the roots are able to acquire more moisture that's in the soil that they wouldn't have otherwise because they would not have grown as much. Now, I know a lot of people hear this over and over again, add organic matter, add organic matter. The question is, what kind of organic matter should I add? What's the best material to use? Well, as long as it's good composted material, it really doesn't matter too much what you use. But let's take a look at 3 different types of organic matter that we can add to our soils to build soils. Now, the first is something just called compost, and this is the result of composting of different types of materials. Oftentimes, municipalities have yard waste compost centers where you can turn in yard waste and they'll compost it over a year or 2, and then you can go back and have it delivered or pick it up. And it's all different types of yard waste materials that have been composted in the soil. And you've got soil material, you've got bark, you've got wood chips involved in there, lots of different materials. And once it's composted, the bacteria will continue to break it down and it goes into the soil. So this is something you can buy in bags under the name of compost, or you could have it delivered from a local soil or mulch company, or pick it up at your municipality, your land waste center. But compost is a good material. It's a good way to take old plant residue and turn it into something that'll go back into the soil. Now, the second material, and I like to use this a lot because it doubles as a mulch, is something called soil conditioner. Now, if you look, you can see the soil conditioner is made up of primarily pine bark, and it's a finely grayed pine bark that is milled very small pieces, and this gets incorporated into the soil. Now, what's nice about pine bark is it does a couple of good things. It really improves infiltration, but it also allows for roots to spread more quickly because it creates nooks and crannies for those roots to spread and for water to channel. So that works out real well. So soil conditioner and good compost. Of course, let's not forget good old-fashioned composted leaf mulch. These are leaves that fall from the trees. We compost them in our own yards in compost piles, or we can buy them from a yard waste center or from a mulch company. But good leaf mulch incorporated into the soil also adds to that soil's biology and to all the other things we've talked about relative to improving soil. Well, now that we've selected the organic matter we're going to incorporate in the soil, let's talk about how to go about doing that. The first thing you need to do with that existing landscape bed that you want to incorporate is to loosen the existing soil. You can either do that by taking a shovel and turning it over, or to till it with a rototiller. But it's really important to loosen that soil, which will allow for an easier incorporation of the organic matter. The next thing is to take your organic matter and put it in that bed. You want to do it at a layer of a minimum of 3 inches, even 4 inches would be great. Folks, you can't put enough organic matter into the soil, so don't worry so much about whether it's 3 or whether it's 4 inches deep. I've chosen to incorporate a couple of different materials, soil conditioner along with the compost. Now you want to turn it over, and if you've got your shovel, it's going to be very difficult and it's going to take quite a long time to turn it with a shovel. So if you're fortunate enough that you can acquire a rototiller, then the best thing to do would be to till in there for 20 minutes in through an area and get that incorporated well. Remember, if you've taken a soil test with the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, add the recommendations for lime and fertilizer at the same time and your bed is ready to go. Great water-wise, good conservation, holds more moisture and better root growth. I think I'm going to fire this up and start mixing. Well, now another very important part of good water-wise gardening has to do with plant selection. And all too often we select the wrong plants for the wrong place and plants don't survive. Really doesn't have a whole lot to do with moisture or drought or water stress, but really that we place that plant in the wrong location. So the first thing we want to talk about is choosing the right plant for the right place. Now I know that sounds a lot like a cliche, but right plant, right place really does work. We need to consider the sunlight exposure versus shade, the type of soil. Now remember, we're going to already have done good site preparation, but we still need to consider what type of soil. And then match those plants for the right sites. Folks, more plants die because they're shade plants and they've been planted in full sun, or plants that require full sun are planted in too much shade, than plants that die from drought or water stress. Take, for instance, this panicum here. This is a great grass. It's very tolerant of a number of different soil types. It has a nice upright habit of growth, works well in a mixed border. We need to consider those things. Remember that it requires full sun. In a shadier location, it's not going to be as robust. So there's that example of right plant, right place. Now the second consideration we need to make when we're thinking about plant selection is choosing natives versus non-natives. Now there's a lot of information out there about how native plants are more drought tolerant than non-natives. Well, that may not necessarily be true. A native plant is a plant that's been in a particular location for many, many, many years. Here's an echinacea, a purple coneflower. This is a white cultivar of that. Just because it's native doesn't make it automatically drought tolerant. We still need to consider the sunlight exposure in the soil and the type of drainage that particular plant needs. Take, for instance, this phlox. Here's a native plant. Phlox grows very well. Now, native plants are adapted to the local conditions, but they're not necessarily adapted to the kind of urban and suburban conditions that we plant them in sometimes. So we need to be concerned about the right plant for the right place again. Japanese maples, a great non-native plant that are very adaptable to dry conditions and water stress. Bee balm can be very invasive. Even though bee balm is a native plant, it can be invasive and have some nasty habits. So again, consider the specific plant that you're thinking about and whether or not you have a spot for it. Now the last aspect of choosing plants and plant selection is drought tolerance. Choose drought tolerant plants. And folks, remember, just because a plant is considered drought tolerant doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't need water at all. Take, for instance, this fennel here. What a great plant to put in a butterfly garden and to have in your garden. This plant is considered quite drought tolerant. So remember that when you plant this plant, it's going to need water to become established. Root establishment is very important for newly planted plants, and depending on the plant, it could take anywhere from 2 months to over a year for those roots to become established. So remember, consider the plant. If it's a perennial or an annual, it's going to need supplementary water frequently for a short period of time. If it's a woody plant, it's going to need supplementary water or irrigation for a longer period of time, and then we need to be thinking about watering efficiently. So remember, choose your plants wisely, consider these considerations when we incorporate them into the landscape, and you won't have to irrigate anywhere near as much as you would if you didn't choose the right plant for the right place. Good water-wise landscapes use plenty of organic mulch in order to conserve water. Now, mulching in the garden has been done for a long time, and here's why. Number one, it conserves moisture. You can reduce a lot of evaporative losses from the soil surface with a good layer of organic mulch. The second advantage is that it controls weeds. It prevents light from hitting the ground, which would often stimulate weed seed germination. And third, it adds a decorative cover to any particular landscape. Now, when I talk to folks about mulching, the first question they always ask is, what's the best kind of mulch? Well, you know, here's what I tell them. One, the best mulch is the mulch that's most available, least expensive, organic, and most preferable to the person that's got that garden. In other words, whatever organic mulch you choose, you've got to like it and be able to afford it. But let's look at some examples. Right over here is hardwood bark. This is bark from hardwood trees, and it's a very popular mulch. It's sold in bags and can be bought bulk from mulch stores. That's the first. Now, a lot of people always ask about, well, pine straw certainly must not be as good as the other mulches. Pine straw is very common in the southeastern region of the United States, and it works just as well. Remember, it's an organic material that's going to break down just like any of the other mulches, so it'll be beneficial to the landscape as well. Now, here's pine bark mulch. Now, this is using the bark of pine trees, and there's a little bit of wood involved in that, and oftentimes you will get pieces of wood in your bark mulches. But the bark mulches work out very well because they have nice dark color, and this pine bark mulch is very, very decorative. And pine bark mulch, again, sold in bags and also can be sold in bulk. You can have it delivered to your home and then use that in the landscape. Now, here's a relatively new mulch that is being used. This is cocoa shells. This is from the chocolate plant, and these are the hulls of the cocoa beans. Now, it has quite an interesting aroma and a nice dark color. Very lightweight, and a lot of people think that maybe the wind will blow it away, but it doesn't. And the longer it stays out in the sun, the darker it gets. The only thing you want to remember about cocoa mulch is that it does tend to be quite expensive. And as a result, you might be using it just exclusively in some small garden areas. Now, let's talk about the proper technique for spreading mulch. Now, you'd think, well, what kind of technique do you need to know to spread mulch? Just spread it. Well, there's a matter of depth and what we do when we put mulch around trees. First of all, recommended depth. The recommended depth for mulch for woody plants is about 3 inches per year. If you can put 3 inches down, that's going to improve the soil and also help with the advantages that I mentioned. Now, around perennials and herbaceous annuals, about 2 inches. You don't want to get it too thick because that doesn't give those plants an opportunity to poke through and grow. So you want to do about a 2-inch layer. But let me show how you would mulch around a tree, because that's a very important thing that a lot of people oftentimes are mistaken about. Now, I've got the hardwood bark mulch here around a tree. This is a dogwood. This is Cornus cusa, and I'm going to spread this mulch with a goal of about 3 inches around the plant. Now, the one thing you want to remember when you're mulching around trees is to pay very close attention to the tree trunk. The tree trunk should not be covered with mulch. A lot of people have the tendency, and I'll show you, a lot of people have the tendency to do this around the trunk of the tree, and that's place the mulch up around the tree in a mound. Well, that's not very good. There's been quite a bit of research done on what happens to the tree trunk underneath that mulch. Oftentimes roots will form, and that will sap energy from the roots that are in the ground. So here's the recommendation. When you mulch, you can still mulch at 3-inch depth around a tree, but keep the mulch away from the base of the tree. This is called the root collar. You can see where the roots meet the trunk of the tree. That always needs to be exposed. We always think it needs to be covered, but it really does need to be exposed. So create a little crater around the base, and then take your mulch, and you can get your 3 inches around there, and it works out real well, but it doesn't get up around the base of the tree. So remember, you always want to keep that root collar exposed. You've got a good 3-inch layer around your woody plants, a 2-inch layer around your herbaceous plants. Great moisture conservation, eliminates that evaporative loss from the soil surface, and it's a wonderful water-wise approach to mulching. Well, with water being at such a premium and a need to be water-wise when we garden, it's real important that we think about watering efficiently. Now, there are lots of different things that we can do to water efficiently. One would be to water early in the morning if we're using an overhead sprinkler system, to water early in the morning to reduce evaporational losses, also late at night. Now, another way that we might approach watering efficiently would be with our automatic watering systems. If you have an automatic sprinkler system that's set on a timer, it's also important to have installed what's called a rain sensor, so that when it rains, that tells the sensor that so much rain has fallen and your irrigation system won't go on after a rain when it's not needed. Make sure you have your automatic system serviced on a regular basis. But today what we really want to focus on are the newly planted trees and shrubs. Here are plants that need to have their roots established, and they're going to need regular irrigation. So it's really important that we understand how much water they need. For example, a woody tree that has a 1-inch caliper, that would be 1-inch diameter, about 6 inches up on the trunk, requires 10 gallons of water per week. And that's what we need to establish that plant. Now the question we all ask then is, well, if that needs 10 gallons per week, how much water is coming out of our hose at any given time? Because we know that hand watering is the most efficient way to water over sprinkling. And if we have newly planted plants, we want to hand water. So how do we do that? Well, we basically want to figure the flow rate of our hose. Now this is how we can do it. Take a 1-gallon milk jug and your hose and set your hose at the rate that you intend to water, which would not be wide open, but you'd want to figure a specific amount that you would open it up, set your watch, a stopwatch, and put the hose into the 1-gallon jug, like so, turn the hose on, and then measure the amount of time it takes to fill that 1 gallon. Now when you do that, you'll get a certain amount of seconds or minutes that it takes to fill the gallon. Remember now, you don't want the hose wide open because that's not how we water. When we hand water, we trickle it out. So you would do that. And let's say, for instance, it was 1 minute to fill the gallon. Well, that means that 1 gallon is coming out of your hose in 1 minute, so you would need to water that tree at that rate coming out of your hose for 10 minutes, and that would give you 10 gallons. Now think of the implications. If you watered that tree for 20 minutes, you'd be watering with 20 gallons of water. That's 10 gallons too much for that week. So knowing the flow rate of your hose is very important. And remember, one of the best ways you can do that would be to put a unit on the end of your hose that you can calibrate so you know how fast the water's coming out. But by figuring your flow rate, you can be efficient with watering newly planted trees and shrubs. Capturing rainwater is a great way to combat water restrictions during periods of drought. Now here's some interesting statistics about water capture off a roof surface. 1,000 square feet of roof surface will yield 600 gallons of water after a 1-inch rainstorm. That's an amazing amount of water. So just think what you could do if you just get a good old-fashioned rain barrel. In last week's show, we talked about rain barrels, and here's an example of a relatively inexpensive rain barrel. It's an old pickle barrel. It's about 65 gallons of water it'll hold. And let's talk about how I put this together here in my own landscape. Now, I placed it near a gutter system, and I wanted to figure out how to get the water into the rain barrel. And so I cut my gutter. I have a plastic gutter. I cut the gutter, and I added a corrugated connection. And you'll notice that that corrugated connection, it actually flows right through to the gutter. So when this is full, I can put it back in here, and excess water will flow, and it won't flow over all over my patio. But when the rain barrel's empty, I pull this out, and pull that there like that, and now when it rains, the water can go into the rain barrel and fill it up. When it's full, I can push it back, reattach it to the gutter, and now excess water is going to go into the storm system rather than overflow in my patio. But it's great. I can fill up this rain barrel. When it gets full, I'm in good shape. Notice the screening. This is very important to prevent mosquitoes from breeding in the water. You don't want to have a rain barrel that's wide open. You want to have it covered, and the screening prevents that. Make sure that the water level after a rain goes down below the screening so mosquitoes won't breed in the water that's above the screening. Here's an overflow valve, and so if you open that up and attach a hose to it, when it does overflow, you can perhaps run that into another rain barrel or an extra storage tank. And then here's your main valve here at the bottom connected to a small hose that I use to fill up buckets with. The other thing I'll do with a good old-fashioned 5-gallon bucket is actually dip it in the rain barrel and pull it out. Of course, that requires a pretty good strong back. Now I do have an auxiliary tank. It's back here. It's an old 40-gallon trash can. And so oftentimes when it is raining, if it's not too hard, I'll come out and I'll open this valve. The water will come out, and I'll take the hose and I'll place it in the overflow tank. Of course, it's full now, but I'll let that fill up until it's done, and when it's finished, I'll close this up, keeping it closed, and then I'll turn my valve off. I'm ready to go. So this is a great approach to collecting rainwater, about 65 gallons. Now, the only other thing you want to remember is sometimes the water can get really smelly because of organic matter that gets in there. 2 ways to combat that odor. 1, you can add a little bit of bleach to the water, about a half a cup to 60 gallons will take away the odor. Or you can also put an old sock on the gutter, and that will prevent some of the organic matter from getting down in there. The smell's not going to hurt the plants. It's just offensive to the people. capturing water with rain barrels is a great way to add water to your landscape. Well, if one rain barrel is good, then that means 2 rain barrels would be that much better. But think about it, that's only about 120 gallons of water. And if you're using that captured water to irrigate your landscape, you might need more. Is there any other equipment that you could use? And the answer is yes. And I've come here to Dr. Helen Krause's house. Helen is a faculty member in the Department of Horticultural Science and an avid gardener, and we've talked to Helen before about gardening. And Helen went one step further. You bought a larger tank, didn't you?
Yeah.
What size is this tank that you've got for water catchment?
It holds 600 gallons.
600 gallons of water. Now tell me a little bit about the setup, Helen. What have you done here?
I have it plumbed so that half of the rainfall that lands on the house runs into this barrel, and then it's plumbed into irrigation that I can water different plants in the landscape.
Now there's no pump in this tank, and so the irrigation is passive. How's that working?
It just lets gravity take care of it. This is the highest point in this landscape, and the water just flows downhill.
I see. Now tell me a little bit about some of the ways you are irrigating some of the plants. I see you've got some strawberries here.
Right. Well, I'm only using this water to irrigate plants that I need to keep productive throughout the summer. So some of my plants, when it gets dry, I just let them go dormant.
Right.
But my strawberries, I want to keep producing. And so they've got drip irrigation that puts it right at the root system.
Any filtering needed? Any kind of backflow? What type of precautions do you need to take when you do this?
You do have to have a filter because there's some debris that'll come off the roof and get into the tank. So you just have what's called a canister filter, and you can rinse it out. You don't have to have backflow protection because you're on an isolated water source.
Exactly.
If you were plumbed into a community water source, you'd have to prevent backflow. You'd have to have a licensed contractor to do
so you don't need any of that. Okay.
Right. Since it's just all the water's coming out of this isolated tank, you can just plumb it yourself.
Now the plumbing material itself, the piping, the emitters, all that's readily available at a local store type of situation. So.
And I suggest you start out by trying to draw a plan of what you want to do. But you know, I drew out a plan, but still I probably made 5 to 6 trips to the store to get fittings that I forgot. But it's pretty easy to do. Nothing real complicated.
How about cost? We talking about a pretty big initial cost? Or?
It is. You know, all total I've spent over $500, including the price of the tank. But, you know, it's going to pay off long term. It'll all stay productive and effective for probably 10 years.
Oh, no question about it. I think that's really a good system with a little bit of upfront cost and a little bit of ingenuity and bravery to go ahead and try to do this. And you've got yourself a good system that's going to last quite a long time. Why don't you take me over and show me where these strawberry plants are planted and what you've got going there. Well, we American home gardeners are preoccupied with turf grass in our home landscapes. Acres and acres and acres of turf grass are used in home landscapes, and it is the #1 water user of all plants in home landscapes. For every 1 square foot of turf, it requires about 8 gallons per week. Now, if we're thinking about water-wise gardening, and if we're thinking about using water efficiently, and we have limited resources when it comes to water, especially here in North Carolina with influx of population and water restrictions due to drought conditions, perhaps one consideration would be to reduce our square footage of turf grass. Now, I'm not suggesting we eliminate our turf grass altogether, but perhaps what we need is to reduce that square footage. Well, here in my own landscape last season, we talked about perhaps doing a small island of turf in this region of the landscape as a means to reduce the lawn square footage. But in lieu of the drought, I chose to try something different using a ground cover. I used Ajuga reptans, which is called carpet bugle, a red-leafed cultivar that has blue flowers. And last season, we plugged some plants about 12 to 18 inches apart. Well, I just wanted to show you in less than a year what's happened with that ground cover. And if you take a look behind me, you can see how those Ajuga plants, they start with a rosette, have started to spread. They send out above ground stems called stolons and produce new plants at the tips. And so you can see right back here how well it's spread. It's going to be about a year, or a little bit more than a year, and it'll be all spread together, and then you'll be able to maintain that. Great alternative to turf. Some of you might be wondering, can you walk on it? Absolutely, you can walk on it. In the early spring, it has purple flowers and makes a nice complement to the Japanese maple behind it. Now, you might be looking and saying, well, Bryce, there are some holes. What's going to happen there? Well, slowly but surely those stolons will grow into those areas. But there's also an easy way to speed that up. Well, since ajuga spreads by rhizomes, it's real easy to vegetatively propagate plantlets that come from the original plant and move them. And here you can see one is actually grown outside the barrier where I have, so we'll go and dig it up. First thing to do is cut a pair of pruners. That cuts the stolon. And now we'll take cultivator, go underneath, and pull it up. Just hold it there. You can see the roots are growing underneath. Take it, walk into the area, and I've got a spot I picked out already. Bare spot right here. Loosen the soil. While I'm planting this, just remember, ajuga is so much different than turfgrass in that it's drought tolerant, it establishes quickly, and it doesn't need anywhere near as much water on a weekly basis. Got that soil loosened, push that new plantlet down in that spot, cover it over, make sure it's secure, and now we've filled in that spot. It'll root out, we'll water it, and we're ready to go. So here's a great alternative to turf, Ajuga reptans carpet bugle. Our plant of the week was suggested to us by Nikki Fabry of Concord, North Carolina. Nikki, thanks for that suggestion, and we'll send you an In the Garden t-shirt. Folks, remember, if you send a suggestion in for a plant of the week to the website and we use it on the air, we'll send you an In the Garden t-shirt as well. Well, Nikki suggested a great summer plant. This is Rudbeckia hirta Indian Summer. That's the cultivar name of this wonderful black-eyed Susan. Now here's a black-eyed Susan that's touted as a perennial, but every once in a while you'll lose it in the garden. But that's okay. Take a look at this plant. It's got huge composite flowers that are yellow that run about anywhere from 4 to 6 inches across. And it flowers profusely from about midsummer until the first frost. Now here's a plant that grows about 1 to 3 feet tall and doesn't require any staking. Folks, this plant doesn't flop at all, and it keeps on flowering. But you've got to remember to go out and deadhead it when the flowers are spent, because by deadheading, you'll encourage new flowers to come. Not only that, occasionally you want to hit it with some water-soluble fertilizer, maybe once every 2 or 3 weeks, and that'll help the plant grow even larger. But what's so great about this plant is even though it's great summer color, it'll move right into fall. It's great for mixed borders, perennial borders, even amongst annuals. I've got 3 or 4 places in my own garden I look forward to putting this plant. It's a great plant of the week, Rudbeckia hirta Indian Summer. Well, folks, that's about all the time we have for this week. So until next time, I'll be looking for you in the garden.
To register for In the Garden, the course, call NC State's Distance Education Program at 1-866-GO-STATE. That's 1-866-467-8283. Or log on to distance.ncsu.edu. For more information about the program or to suggest a plant of the week, go to unctv.org/inthegarden.
Funding for In the Garden is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV. And by Academic Programs and North Carolina Cooperative Extension. Both are members of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at North Carolina State University. Additional funding is provided by the North Carolina Nursery and Landscape Association and the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. Introducing TarHeelGardening.com, your online consumer resource for North Carolina's green industry. More information is available.
Podcasts on UNC-TV.org are made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV.